like to welcome you to a new podcast series from the Stevenson School for Ministry, based out of the Episcopal Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. I am Marsha Roscoe, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and also the founder of Breathing in Christ. And we are very excited to record this new podcast series, which focuses on what it means to be practicing forward as resilient and adaptable leaders in the church, especially as we think about preparing for what comes next. With me today is Reverend Dr. Gina Campbell. She is Professor of Worship and Liturgy at Wesley Theological Seminary, and Gina's gifts go well beyond worship and liturgy. She has extensive experience with family systems theory and resilient and adaptive leadership. You know, what I really appreciate most about you, Gina, is your passion for helping us encounter the living God in profound ways.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be here.
Gina, you have been such a deeply insightful thought leader who has been walking with our church leaders and our Stevenson School students in thinking about our roles as leaders in the church. And so we are really thankful that you are here. And today we're going to focus on lament as a practice that serves as a threshold for hope and newness in a time of distress. And before we get started, I just want to offer a quick word about the resources that we will provide to go deeper. So as Gina references some deeper book lists and resources, we will put those on our website and provide some further exploration points of these topics. But let's not delay, let's get right into our conversation with Reverend Campbell. So Gina, as we think about our roles as leaders in the church, what led you to think about lament as a threshold to hope?
I was thinking back that in my 40 years of ministry, nothing really has felt like this since 9/11, where the national attention was captured and it was kind of an unthinkable experience for people. But my memory of that time is that the church closed that up as quickly as possible and got right back to business as usual. And I think we paid a price for that in terms of the churches were full and then they emptied out right away. We didn't hold that space open for people to do the work they needed to do. This is different in that we've got a longer period of time to think about how we want to be as we're preparing to open the doors and as we open the doors. A rabbi friend of mine said to me at the time, we went straight from the Twin Towers to Afghanistan and there was nothing in between.
Right.
We have an opportunity to do something different here. And so then I began to think about stories, because I always like to start with stories. And I have a friend who's a physician, he's a neuropsychologist, and he said he remembered a time when a young girl came into his office and she hadn't done something she was supposed to do, so she didn't get her way. And so she was all riled up with lament and crying and frustration. And he said, I'm so glad you can cry. And her mother immediately tried to calm her down and get her to stop crying. And the physician said, I wanted her to keep her lament moving because then we could get somewhere. So when you shut something down, you shut down possibility. And that raised the question for me about what is the cost of avoiding the negativity, the lament, the things that have to be said that don't sound polite to us or to God, but is there a price for shutting that down that could look like something new? So that was one story. Second thing I remembered was a long time ago, I read a study that was done of the city of Dallas, 15 years after the assassination of President Kennedy there. And the city still had no memorial. And my husband lived there at the time, and he said it was so weird because for 15 years, anytime you told people you lived in Dallas, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. But the city hadn't found any way to acknowledge it. And part of the study was what happened to people's health. And the rates of cancer and heart disease went way up. So it raised a question for me about the holding of lament in the body. and not having any way to express it, press it out, express it. And the body as individuals, but also the corporate body. What happens to the body of Christ when we can't lament the strangeness of this time and how we can't configure in usual ways? So that was the second story. The third story I thought about was my dear friend Rabbi Horowitz said, one cannot console a mourner when their dead lie before them. First, you have to sit. Then you question all the whys, how come, why me? Then you have to allow the memory to rise up. And then is when the healing and the possibility come. So in other words, he's talking about a process, and you move through all these steps in order to get to the new space. And I think that lament opens up the question of possibility. So for me, as I was thinking about hope and this time, I thought, how do we support, encourage, invite the lament so that people can keep what they've started towards newness, so people don't have to hold it in their bodies, so congregations don't have to hold it in their bodies? Because the other thing that Rabbi Horowitz said is, if you don't work through that entire process, all you will have is sorrow, no newness.
Oh, wow. Right.
And I thought about how much I'm hearing from pastors I'm talking to right now, friends, family, about grief. And you have to acknowledge there is grief. You read the obituaries and you see how many delayed funerals there are going to be. And people are having to fire people that they've had work for them for years. And people are losing children. I mean, farmers are plowing under beautiful crops. There is real grief. But it has to be more. You know, if we settle for the grief and the sorrow, I believe this, and lament is the process where you work through this, you will not come out, we will not come out on the other side with the kind of possibility that this time offers us. And the last thing I thought about here, there's a woman I have read named Denise Ackerman. She's a South African woman. And she has written in her book, and this is on the book list, a chapter on lament. And this is one of the most powerful descriptions of lament I've ever heard. Lament is akin to mourning, and at times difficult to distinguish from mourning. It is also more. It is somehow more purposeful than mourning. It signals that relationships and circumstances have gone terribly wrong. It is more than railing against suffering, a breast beating or confession of guilt. It is a coil of suffering and hope, awareness and memory, anger and relief, a desire for vengeance, forgiveness, and healing that beats upon the heart of God. It is our way of bearing the unbearable. As we, in Joel's words, rend our hearts and not our clothing. It is in essence supremely human. So for me, those kind of stories and questions have been a part. The language that Christians have to address that is the language of lament. And it is a way forward. So that's kind of where I started.
Yeah, I mean, what a beautiful image that is of beating upon the heart of God. Wow.
Isn't that a wonderful phrase?
It is. It is. You know, Gina, I'm curious about what images and sounds and voices are you discovering that really speak to this notion of lament as deeply critical in a life with God and raising up the possibilities of hope?
I actually read an article in the paper yesterday or the day before and heard somebody say that they felt like they were in exile. And all of a sudden, I was in that godly place story about the exile and the return. And, you know, in that story, the people of God are being marched across the desert in the desert box, and you hear the sound of their feet, you know, moving into the sand. And they're moving across the river into Babylon. And you have this heavy metal chain. And you drop it into the desert box, and you hear the clank of the chain, and you hear this thud into the sand. And the storyteller's word after that is, and they could not go home.
Mm.
So the image I had I love that story to tell it when in the Godly Play classroom, but that image of, here are the people of God, they're being forced out of the only place they think they can pray and be and worship God. This horrible thud, home is gone. They go to the banks of the river in Babylon, and the psalm, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And then for no clear, huge reason, after years, and I'm simplifying this story enormously, they begin to be able to trickle back to home. But they will not rebuild the temple in the same way. They will not rebuild their worship in the same way. I have this image of that story, and that the sound of that chain hitting sand. I don't know. I think Lament has sense and sound and music and movement, and somehow that story captures some of that for me. And then that made me begin to think about Walter Brueggemann, and his work around the Psalms of orientation, the Psalms of disorientation, and the Psalms of new orientation. And I was thinking, and he says, you're in orientation and it's your happy place, and Psalm 1, Psalm 8, Psalm 100. And Brueggemann describes it as not the most interesting place for God's people to be, because there's no real tension, but there's also not much happening. It's just sort of in Friedman language, it's homeostasis. Things just kind of are clicking along. And then there's a moment. And so I was thinking, okay, we'd been in orientation, and then here's this moment, the thud of the chain. We can't go home. And he calls that relinquishment. And he says, we fight it with everything in us.
Yeah, we do.
So you're beginning to see that come up, and, we got to reopen. We can't stand this anymore. As I'm running, I hear it on the trail. Well, they didn't close like this during this. There's just a lot of pushing back against what if you move to the next place, which he calls disorientation, is painful. It's hard. It's all those things that Ackerman was describing. It's the beating upon the heart of God. It's the anguish. It's the frustration. It's the hurt. It's the sense of persecution. It's the sense of, what is this? And to me, there is a place for leadership in the church right now. Steve Dowdy's book is also on the book list, and he has a chapter in there on lamentation as a gift for leaders. And he says, this is the time to shine the beam of awareness precisely where it needs to shine.
Oh, can you say that again?
To shine the beam of awareness precisely where it needs to shine. So don't worry about polite speech. It probably means we'll speak to God in the way that some of our congregations aren't used to speaking to God. It's probably going to upset some of our theology. We're going to have to, it's a rigorous, indelicate kind of speech. It's the beating on God. At another place, Ackerman says, we beat on God and say, you are a partner in this covenant, act like it. And having the courage to do that, and being willing to go to that space inside ourselves. And then Brueggemann says that somewhere in all of that, this will be the language, the Psalms about the pit. This will be the songs about being thrown into prison. This is Psalm 137. This is bash the babies' heads of our enemies against the rock. This is all those things that we nice Christian people would never say out loud. Yes. or to God. But this place of disorientation says we must. And Brueggemann says when you kind of, it's like to me, it's a little bit like thinking about a toddler who finally exhausts themselves with their tantrum, and then they begin to get happy again. Somewhere in that, now Brueggemann doesn't say that, he might find that insulting, but somewhere at the bottom of all that emotional work, a little spark begins to turn and the praise begins to emerge again. That's why I think it's only 2 of the Psalms of lament in the book of Psalms, it's 1 or 2, don't resolve in praise.
Right, right.
Because for the lament to be complete, praise has to emerge, but it's not going to sound like Psalm 1.
Right.
It's going to be praise after having come through the fire, after the rigor. So when he talks about new orientation, Psalm 138, he's talking about once you've had that exchange of candor, once the people have said unthinkable things to God, and God has still been present to the people, then something, it's like having been through the refiner's fire. The praise that arises is very different. And to me, part of the leadership issue will be facilitating the lament and listening for the turn.
Right, right.
And Brueggemann says it comes as a surprise, like you can't manufacture it. You can't manufacture that emotion. You can't tell when it's going to happen. But he says, all of a sudden, we are granted a vision of hope and escape and movement where we saw no hope, escape, and movement. And so that's, to me, how lament opens the space for hope. But it takes a kind of honesty and strong language that I don't think our congregations are very good at. Ed Friedman used to say that in American society, the place we work out our lament now is in the court system, in litigiousness.
How painful, but true. Yeah.
And that nobody ever finds that satisfying, but that's what they do. And I think it's because, I don't know if it's in part of the outgrowth of trying to be welcoming and everybody can come here. We've lost that language. Now, all communities haven't. I would suggest that the African American community has still maintained a pretty significant language of lament in ways that other communities have not. They've maintained the spirituals as you know, a big part of how they are together as a community and that they form around. They've maintained the Old Testament stories much better than many Christian churches, because those stories of exile and being freed, they're so caught up in part of their own experience and story that they may have a slightly more vibrant way to access lament than other congregations do. But anyway, those were some of the places and thoughts that helped me shape the notion of how hope springs from lament. The other piece of that I've been playing with is, again, a South African, Trevor Hudson, says, there's a dangerous illusion that we can build a more equitable, compassionate, and just society and remain the same.
Right, right.
And lament suggests that that is not possible. That whatever happens in lament, if it's not transformative, then it probably wasn't lament. Might have been more sorrow, might have been more grief. And so the movement really comes out of that lament and then being surprised by God's grace, I think.
I mean, Brueggemann very powerfully uses the Psalms to express our experiences as a movement into the presence of God through this orientation, disorientation, and new orientation.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way that you think our leaders can think about lament as a similar movement? You know, are there guides or thoughts for a process for others or for ourselves in this movement?
I was wondering what it would be like online. Maybe a pastor sort of introduces the notion of lament, and maybe I've included the classic model of lament on some of the resources. And I can also go back and attach some lament psalms that people, what if you invited people to study the lament psalms and and then like had a lament night online? What would it be like to gather people around that very notion of, what would it be like to, I know it's the great 50 days of Easter, but what would it be like to use lament hymns? Like the song that's going through my mind right now is that very old hymn, How Can I Keep From Singing? My life goes on, an endless song, above verse lamentation. I have a Judy Collins version of that I have been playing, that just, but I also remember hearing Martin Sheen sing it on a Garrison Keillor thing. It's the difference in voices makes that song so differently appealing. What would it be like to use music? What would it be like to ask people to go outside and see lament in nature? I do believe that's one place where sort of the movement around earth and nature right now could be a part of our own healing. Where's nature lamenting as well? We can get all focused on our own self, but maybe this is a time to think about the bigger universe that God has made, and how that needs to be a part of our moving forward. Poetry, I've included on the book list a thing I found a few years ago, Poems from Guantanamo. There's a long history of lament poetry that comes out of prisons and jails and people who have been jailed for political purposes. Scottish bagpipes. You can find Irish keening online. Images, the Trail of Tears, the Wailing Wall. How could art and sound and sense and movement, remember, lament is tearing your clothes and ripping your garments. How could we as people of faith, find different ways to enter into the Psalms? What would it be like to invite people to write their own Psalms of lament? One of the things I have discovered in coaching groups over the years is if I ask someone in a group what their family needs to lament, they can always tell me.
Oh, okay.
People know it's just beneath the surface, but we don't invite it. How could we invite? In the Dowdy book that's also on the list, at the end of his chapter, he has some questions for thinking about lament and leadership that might spark creativity in a pastor or in a congregation. But I'm just saying, I don't think it's lecturing. I think it's discovering the lament, releasing the lament. Trevor's word of expressing the lament, getting it out of ourselves, and then watching for the surprise.
Yes.
Watch the surprise. So I guess I was just thinking, how could we make it all right for our people to say how bad it is, and to say it in a prayerful way, and to shake their fist at heaven and bless that.
Right.
And not to get, I'm hearing all these grief things, and the pastoral instinct is going to be to try to comfort and close that up. I wanted her to keep going so that she could get somewhere.
Right.
So I guess I would be thinking to ask yourself, how do you keep it going so that you can get somewhere? How do we not stop in sorrow, but continue to move forward? How do we not hold it in our bodies? All those stories at the beginning, how do we turn those things into possibilities for people? Because the hope is there. That's not specific, but it's ways I would be moving. And the Psalms, because they provide the classic model, and because they show the turning to praise, we don't have to like start with a blank slate. We have a beginning place. How do we do that as communities and families and individuals? That's the question, I think.
Yeah, I think you so beautifully invited us to use our five senses. I mean, that's the way that we make our way through the world and how we figure out and understand who we are and where we're going. And so that direct invitation to say, enter the senses and explore and discover, but there's no prescribed formula for getting through lament.
Right.
But in the midst of all of that, what you've really done is shown us how lament is a divine rhythm. I mean, it's something that God's present within that. And so when we move with God in that natural rhythm, we're better able to position ourselves as less non-anxious leaders filled with hope. And that's probably the best that we can do right now.
I think it's what God gives us to do right now.
Yes.
So do we have the courage for it is the question to me. And I think it will ask something of leaders that is perhaps different than other ways of leading. And I think it'll ask something of congregations that's different than the invitations they're used to responding to. But I can imagine that one might discover new ways of being neighbor or being neighbored to. That one would discover there's going to be great joy in being together again, even if we hated the meetings. Now we can't wait to get to them.
Right.
That somehow what it means to have been God's people will be fresh with us in a different way.
Yeah, the hope that I have is that there seems to be a real longing for meaningful connections more than seeking people out for validation or affirmation. I mean, I'm hearing this more and more that there's leadership teams that normally didn't get along that now are, because they're really understanding meaningful connections right now. So that's hope that I see. I'm not sure we've made that pivot yet, but
Right.
It's definitely surfacing of what it means to have meaningful connections with the hope that God is here and calling us to be present.
Brueggemann would push a little bit on the meaning language.
Okay.
He would say it really is justice language.
Oh, okay. Say more.
Like I'd have to go back and reread this part more carefully, but he says if we're not careful, we make it about meaning and love and not about the justice of God. And part of what I think is really living fully into the great commandment, and that if I'm not objecting. I do think it's about connecting.
Yeah.
But I think it's about connecting around a differently configured world.
Sure.
And of course, when your goal is bigger and broader than yourself, it's going to be a deeper connection. It's
Right.
going to be a different connection.
Yes.
But he would say, how is this how does this look more like God's plan for us to be together? So he would push a little bit on language.
Right.
Not on connection.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that the idea being that we're going to be struggling with our purpose.
Yes.
And so I think if we don't go through the lament process in these beautiful expressions and these movements, then we will lose sight of what the purpose is. And that is, as you said, to love God deeper and to love our neighbors.
And to take care of ourselves, to love ourselves.
Absolutely.
And I think, it's going to be hard for some of us to love ourselves while shaking our fist at God.
Yeah.
Because that's not what we were taught good boys and girls did.
Sure. Yeah, but what you're teaching us, though, is lifting up that is an act of loving God, because that's dealing with it, processing it, letting it leave the body, so that way we can be healthier and transformed on the other side.
Yes. So.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
Very powerful. Well, I really want to thank you for taking this time. And I believe we are going to be looking forward to some future episodes. And thank you for the time that you are gifting. Really, we hope the global community. I think we're all in the season of lament, whether we recognize it or not. And your gifts are deeply needed. So thank you for being here and being present with us. And we do pray that all of you who are listening are staying healthy and finding ways to breathe a bit deeper in Christ.